In April 1946, 48-year-old Juanita Brooks walked into the Salt Lake City offices of David O. McKay, expecting to meet with the man who was then second counselor in the first presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Brooks was writing her book on the Meadows Massacre, and she wanted to talk with McKay because she knew he was in possession of affidavits made by men who participated in the atrocity. The affidavits had been taken by a St. George attorney, David H. Morris, an acquaintance of Brooks who told her he had a number of these affidavits but failed to show them to her before she died. After Morris's death, his foster daughter, Helen Hafen, took the affidavits and other disturbing documents she encountered in his papers and personally delivered them to the first presidency of the church. I must get those accounts written by men who actually participated in that thing, a distraught Brooks wrote after learning the affidavits were now out of her reach. When Brooks had phoned President McKay's office to make the appointment to see him, his personal secretary had been very cordial. My name had evidently not registered enough to make her remember who I was, Brooks wrote. But it was evident as soon as she saw me in his office that I was a red flag. This secretary wanted to know precisely what it was that I wished to talk to Brother McKay about, Brooks said. I think that if it had been about the weather, she would have let me in without hesitation. Instead, after hearing what Brooks wanted, the secretary passed Brooks off to Joseph Anderson, secretary to the first presidency as a whole. Now, Brooks, we know, was a strong woman, but she didn't know who she was up against, and apparently didn't even remember the name of the woman who was McKay's personal secretary. Well, what we know now is that it was Claire Middlemas, who, as McKay's secretary, was one of the most powerful women in the church, and she wielded that power to decide who would and who wouldn't have access to her boss. This is Middlemas on the far right with David O. McKay and his family. Middlemas had her reasons to shield McKay from a historian who wanted to write about a controversial subject in Latter-day Saint history. Though Brooks didn't know it quite yet, church leaders, when Juanita shows up in McKay's office, church leaders were then moving towards excommunicating her friend and McKay's niece, Fawn McKay Brody, for her 1945 biography of Joseph Smith titled No Man Knows My History. Brooks would soon document what happened next in a letter to her friend and mentor, Dale Morgan. And my fellow panelist, Richard Saunders, has written a fantastic biography of Dale Morgan I recommend to everyone. Secretary Joseph Anderson, again, the first presidency secretary, he told Brooks to come back the next day after he presented her case to the first presidency. So when Brooks returned for the verdict, Anderson invited her to sit down on the opposite side of a table from him. He held in his hand a large brown envelope full of folded papers and encased by an elastic band. Brooks noted that the envelope was so old that it was cracking along its edges. This isn't the actual envelope. This was an envelope that was inside that larger envelope, but you can see here how this one was kind of cracking, and this is what Juanita described. Anderson cleared his throat and began. Well, Sister Brooks, I took the matter up with the brethren last night, and one of them sat down with me, and we went over all this material with me very carefully, and which one of the brethren? Brooks interrupted. Brother Clark, Anderson answered, referring to J. Reuben Clark, an attorney and the first counselor in the first presidency. Anderson continued, well, we went over the material carefully, and I am instructed to tell you that there is nothing here that will do you any good. So the answer is no, Juanita asked. Well, it adds to that, yes, Brother Anderson answered. I should like to have a chance to decide for myself whether or not the material would be of any value to me, Brooks wrote. And I think Anderson honestly would like to have permitted me to see it, but he didn't dare take the material from the envelope. Anderson did tell Brooks that there were 3 signed typescript affidavits from Massacre participants, 2 from Nephi Johnson and 1 from Samuel Knight. I know there's Knight descendants here today. Nephi Johnson was the Massacre participant who had wanted to tell the 19-year-old Juanita Brooks something that he had never uttered before, but she was not able to hear his story before he died. So it must have been particularly an agony for her to sit and see those documents in front of her that would have been those words from Nephi Johnson that she had no access to still. At the end of her meeting with Anderson, Brooks boldly told him, quote, that I should not trouble him or the brethren again, but that I wish he would tell David O. McKay that someday I expect to actually talk directly to him. While Brooks described this episode as a total flop, those of us today looking back on it with the perspective of exactly 80 years this month may see it as fascinating and revealing, not only because of what was brought up in this meeting, but because of what wasn't. For something else that was in the first presidency's possession in 1946, a collection that had been there for more than 50 years would have been of even greater value, indeed far greater value to Brooks's research than the 3 affidavits that were in the Morris collection, as invaluable as those 3 documents were. So, what was this collection? Beginning in the 1880s, Orson F. Whitney, who later became an LDS apostle, was writing the first of what was to be a multi-volume history of Utah, to be put out by the publisher George Q. Cannon and Sons. A ghostwriter for the volume, John Q. Cannon, informed his father, George Q., a member of the First Presidency, that few primary sources were available about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and that the History of Utah book would benefit from new research on the subject. I was going to go back to Juanita's picture. In 1892, George Q., who also happened to be the first counselor in the First Presidency, convinced Church President Wilford Woodruff and second counselor Joseph F. Smith to commission a historian named Andrew Jensen. And is Reed Nielsen still? Reed Nielsen is a biographer of Andrew Jensen. We've got some great biographers in the audience today. They hired Jensen to travel to southern Utah to interview people still living who had personal and eyewitness knowledge of the massacre. The First Presidency sent a letter, signed by all 3 of them, encouraging people to talk to Jensen, with the assurance that the interviewees' names would be kept confidential. The January 21st, 1892 letter concluded, "We are desirous to obtain all the information that is possible upon this subject, not necessarily for publication, but that the church may have it in its possession for the vindication of innocent parties, and that the world may know when the time comes the true facts connected with it." It was likely because of this letter of introduction from the First Presidency that previously closed-mouth massacre insiders were willing to tell all to Andrew Jensen. Jensen was able to interview 17 massacre participants and witnesses of events surrounding the massacre that proved to be detailed and incredibly insightful. After completing this fact-finding tour, Jensen turned his notes over to John Q. Cannon, who used them vaguely in the writing of his History of Utah, but without attribution or mention of the sources' names. Jensen's sources were then taken into possession of George Q. Cannon and the First Presidency. Jensen's notes and reports of these interviews provide a much clearer picture of what happened with the massacre and when. These documents illuminate key subjects, such as Cedar City leaders' efforts to spy on the Arkansas Wagon Company and to gather local Paiute Indians to participate in an assault against them, of Mormon militiamen's killings of immigrants outside of the encampment of the company before the massacre, and the so-called Tan Bark Council in Parowan, Utah, at which state president and colonel of the Iron Military District, William H. Dane, gave permission to state president and militia major Isaac Haight to carry out the destruction of the members of the immigrant company who were still alive before the final massacre on September 11th, 1857. These documents are key to understanding the motives and incidents that caused the tragic domino effect that led to the massacre. Unfortunately, Juanita Brooks never saw them. And so they, and the key information within them, do not appear in her 1950 book, The Mountain Meadows Massacre. In my research for this paper, indeed, I could not find any evidence that Brooks was ever aware of the existence of this collection. And Richard Saunders is agreeing with me. And indeed, if she were aware of it, she certainly would have asked McKay and Anderson to see those affidavits as well as those in the Morris collection. Less than 2 months after returning home from her failed trip to church headquarters in Salt Lake City, Brooks learned of the excommunication of Fawn Brodie. This led Juanita to believe that she too would be excommunicated for publishing her forthcoming book on the massacre. Quote, "I feel sure that as soon as the MMM study is finished, I'll be out," in all caps, she wrote to Dale Morgan. And to Brodie herself, she wrote, "I'll not be surprised to be cut off right below the ears when this MMM thing is finished." Well, why am I sharing this story with you today? I wanted to juxtapose Brooks's experience with that of my co-author Rick Turley, who's here today, and our colleagues as we researched and prepared for publication what became a 2-volume history of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, to see what conclusions we can come up with by comparing these two very different experiences. Rick, myself, and our colleagues in the LDS Church History Department were aware of the David H. Morris and Andrew Jensen collections, which were still in the possession of the First Presidency as we were preparing the books for publication in the early 2000s. Rick requested access to them from then President of the Church, Gordon B. Hinckley, but we did not know whether or not we would receive access to them ourselves, and indeed waited anxiously for that permission as we drew closer and closer to the publication date. I will never forget the day when Rick walked down the hall to my office and said, "Come to my office." And I walked in and I sat across a table from him, and he set the collections down. And it was a stunning moment. And for me to be able to hold in my hands these documents that my predecessor, a Mormon woman writing about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, had not had access to but dearly wanted, was an incredible experience for me. I will never forget. And as I mentioned, those documents, we use them in both of our books, and it tells a far more clear and accurate and an insightful picture of the motives behind what happened with the massacre. Well, I wanted to kind of invite audience participation a bit here. Why do you think there were the differences? Why was Juanita Brooks denied these documents in 1946 and we received access to them in, I believe it was 2006? Yes?
Simply because she wrote it and people were like, "Oh, we didn't tell her things." I think there were people that did not tell her things because they were afraid.
Mm-hmm.
And after the book came out and they saw what happened after the book came out, they were like, "Oh, bad things didn't happen." And they were willing to
Yeah.
let those things be known.
That's a great point. And Rick and I felt the irony in this when we looked at these, because what they clearly shows, even more so than before, is this was a local thing, that they clearly show that Brigham Young did not order the massacre and actually vindicate him, if you will, of ordering the massacre. So ironically, if those things had been allowed to be published earlier, that knowledge could have been out sooner. So that's a great point. Other reasons, do you think, why she was denied them in 46, why we got them in 2006? Richard?
1946 or 1948?
This was 46.
Because in 46, especially by that point, the second generation of Latter-day Saints were going away.
Mhm.
The people who were adults in the 1940s had also lived through the 1920s, which had been very much all-American, looking forward. That's also the time where the Daughters of the Confederacy began their campaign of the lost cause. The entire country was caught up in the space of remembering and appropriate remembering. In other words, don't make a mess of the past.
That's a great point. Yeah, so it's like we don't want to bring out the dirt, if you will. Let's just kind of forget and let this lie. Excellent point. Thank you, Dr. Saunders. Any other thoughts, ideas? Yes, in the back.
Well, first of all, it was a man and a woman who went to Mass and not
There's probably something to that. Yeah.
Second, the man who went was working for the church and they had trust in him.
There you go. Amen. Richard E. Turley Jr. had been church working assistant, no, excuse me. He had been managing director of the church history department since he was 29 years old, hired by Dallin H. Oaks. And he eventually became assistant church historian. And so through all of those years, he had earned the trust of the brethren, the leaders of the church by that time. And as you say, he was an insider. Juanita Brooks was an outsider. She was not working for the church. She did not have the trust. And frankly, her good friend, Fawn Brody, had just written a book that church leaders saw as very threatening, and so they're like, we don't need another uppity woman writing another book about a controversial topic in church history. Excellent. Okay, any other? Ryan?
Gordon B. Hinckley was probably the closest historian prophet that we've had, at least this century.
Okay, so Gordon...
So I think he knew about history more than the average, more than probably, President McKay did.
Okay, great point. So Gordon B. Hinckley was more conversant with LDS history, less threatened by it, perhaps. And so he was the one that granted that permission. And he did say he had read through all these materials earlier. So, okay.
Different secretary.
Different secretary. I don't know. Anyways, I won't go into detail there, but yes, in the back.
I think that over those 40 years, there has been a shift in the historical community in general.
Yes.
Where sweeping things under the carpet
Yeah.
was no longer the style. It was turning to this honesty and transparency in all history. And
Right.
taking the whitewash out of it.
Exactly. And of course, Leonard Arrington's Camelot, if you will, that doesn't start until the 1970s when Leonard Arrington becomes a church historian, and then you start having professionally trained PhD historians writing LDS history, which had not happened before. So there's that change and that shift in the professionalization of telling history. So Juanita Brooks was an insider when it came to the church at the personal level. She was a descendant of early Mormon pioneers. She was born and raised in the church and was also serving as Stake Relief Society president during much of the time that she was researching and writing about the massacre. But as we pointed out, at the institutional level, she was an outsider. She was a Southern Utahn who lived hundreds of miles from Salt Lake City headquarters of the church, including from its historical department. And as we've talked about, she was ahead of her time. I think because she was mentored by Dale Morgan, she was ahead of her time and forward-thinking on telling, the professional storytelling of the massacre. So Brooks's book, The Mountain Meadows Massacre, won no awards. In fact, the best that she could say about its reception 12 years after its publication, and with some exaggeration, was that it found a very sympathetic audience among the people of Utah, especially among the historians and teachers of the institutions of higher learning. Though no recognition came from the authorities of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, neither did any official condemnation. Massacre at Mountain Meadows and Vengeance's Mine are thoroughly informed by the information in the primary sources found in the Morris and Jensen collections, as well as hundreds of other sources that we had, the Church History Department had funding to send researchers across the country gathering more information. So Brooks certainly would have envied all of these sources that we have access to. Although some of the Mountain Meadows Massacre book, Juanita's book, some of its methodology and scholarly perspectives are now dated, the book did help create a climate of openness in Mormon studies, and indeed she and Fawn Brody are often credited with starting what is called the New Mormon History. So while Juanita's book does not have all of the information that these two books and many others have today, I do believe that Juanita Brooks will always, and deservedly so, hold her place in public consciousness as the preeminent historian of the massacre, not only because she was the first, a half century before the rest of us, but also because she accomplished what she did as an outsider without the support and at times even the opposition of not only her local community, but also the institutional church. The courage, the tenacity, and the sacrifice that it took for Juanita to publish her book was what inspired me as I did my own work on the massacre. And it's for these reasons that we dedicated Vengeance's Mine to Juanita Brooks. Thank you.